Imagine building a life of luxury and success, only for your entire world to come crashing down in one tragic moment. Mikey Simmons, a wealthy trans woman, seemed to have it all: a doting husband, Tyrone, a successful career, and a lavish lifestyle. But beneath the surface of her perfect life, an affair and a deadly disease would bring everything to a devastating end. This story explores the dark consequences of infidelity, secrecy, and the dangerous price of betrayal. When trust is shattered in the most intimate of relationships, the results can be lethal. Mikey's affair and the deadly consequences it set in motion remind us just how destructive lies can be when they come to light. Before we unravel this disturbing tale, like and subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more stories that expose the darkest corners of human behavior. Mikey Simmons, a 35-year-old African-American trans woman, lived a life that many could only dream of. She was married to Tyrone Simmons, a 42-year-old charismatic businessman, who adored her and treated her like royalty. Together, they built an empire, a luxurious home in Atlanta, a fleet of cars, and social status that put them among the city's elite. From the outside, their life was perfect, seemingly untouched by the kinds of struggles that plagued others. Mikey had a successful career in fashion, her image carefully curated, always in the public eye, always pristine. But beneath the glossy surface, Mikey felt trapped. Despite her seemingly perfect life with Tyrone, there was a gnawing emptiness inside of her. Mikey, though happily married, struggled with a part of her identity that remained hidden even from the man she loved. For years, she had suppressed her true desires, the need for intimacy with someone who could give her something that Tyrone couldn't. While Tyrone gave her everything materially, emotionally, she longed for something else, something more raw, something more free. Her internal conflict reached a breaking point when she met Jasmine Clark, a fiery 26-year-old lesbian who worked in the same high society circles as Mikey. Jasmine had a magnetic energy, an independence that Mikey admired, and a physical attraction Mikey couldn't deny. It didn't take long before their flirtations turned into secret meetings, stolen moments that Mikey thought no one would notice. At first, Mikey convinced herself that it was just an escape, a brief affair with no long-term consequences. Jasmine offered Mikey something that her marriage couldn't: a sense of freedom, wild excitement, and an intensity that burned through the quiet parts of Mikey's life. But as the months went by, Mikey's guilt and desire collided in an overwhelming storm. She couldn't let go of Jasmine, and the affair became a web of lies, one that Mikey wove carefully to keep Tyrone in the dark. However, in her pursuit of this forbidden love, Mikey unknowingly opened the door to a far darker reality. One that would change her life, and Tyrone's, in ways she could never have imagined. The affair was more than just a fling, and the reckless, unprotected encounters with Jasmine carried a heavy price, a price that Mikey would pay in the most tragic way possible. Little did Mikey know, the bliss she found in Jasmine's arms would soon set off a deadly chain of events. Mikey's affair with Jasmine deepened in intensity with each passing day. What began as a stolen kiss in a dimly lit corner of an upscale bar soon spiraled into passionate, uncontrollable moments in secret hotel rooms and late-night rendezvous in the back of Jasmine's car. Mikey, always the composed and refined businesswoman in public, found herself shedding those layers in the presence of Jasmine. With Jasmine, Mikey was free to explore the parts of her identity she had long buried, the parts of herself she had never dared show her husband, Tyrone. The affair was fueled by desire, an explosive connection that she couldn't resist. Their encounters were charged with an intensity that felt like a dangerous secret, a thrilling escape from the rigid life Mikey had built with Tyrone. But as passion overran Mikey's better judgment, it led to reckless decisions. During one particularly passionate evening, Mikey and Jasmine engaged in unprotected sex. Both were intoxicated by the heat of the moment, lost in the forbidden nature of their love. What Mikey didn't know was that Jasmine had been living with HIV for some time. It was a truth Jasmine had carefully hidden from her, from everyone. Jasmine's past, filled with risky sexual encounters, had led to her contracting the virus, but it was a fact she had kept hidden from Mikey, part of the dangerous game they were playing. Jasmine knew the risk she was taking, but the recklessness of their affair made it all feel like a game. She didn't think about the consequences, only the thrill of it all. As the weeks went on, Mikey began to feel different. At first, it was small things, a feeling of fatigue, some unexplainable aches, and a slight fever that she chalked up to stress from her busy lifestyle. She thought little of it at first. But then she noticed her body was changing in ways she couldn't ignore. After a particularly painful night, she went to the doctor for routine blood work, only to receive the devastating news that she had tested positive for HIV. The news hit Mikey like a thunderbolt. She felt a deep sense of betrayal, not just from Jasmine, but from herself. Mikey knew the implications of this diagnosis, and as a woman who had spent years maintaining an impeccable public image, the idea of her private life being exposed terrified her. More than that, she knew the gravity of the situation she was in. She had just introduced the virus into her marriage. Mikey's mind raced with thoughts of what would happen if Tyrone found out, if the world knew what had transpired behind the walls of their beautiful home. She couldn't bear the thought of it, and so she kept the secret buried deep within her, even as it ate away at her. Mikey began to pull away from Tyrone, making excuses for her lack of intimacy and withdrawal. Tyrone, ever the attentive husband, noticed the changes in her but couldn't fathom what was really happening. Mikey couldn't bring herself to tell him the truth. She couldn't admit that her affair had not only betrayed his trust but had also put their future at risk in the most devastating way imaginable. Meanwhile, Jasmine's behavior had also begun to change. She grew distant, aware of the growing tension and fear in Mikey's eyes, knowing that Mikey had likely been infected by her. Jasmine, too, was beginning to feel the weight of her choices, though she had always justified them as part of the passion and excitement she felt with Mikey. Yet as the days passed, her own sense of guilt began to creep in, along with the realization that her actions could now destroy Mikey's marriage, and with it, her life as she knew it. Mikey's secret, once only a part of her love affair with Jasmine, now had the power to unravel everything: her marriage, her carefully crafted reputation, and her future. She found herself caught in a storm of lies and deceit, with no way out, no way to undo the chain of events she had set into motion. Little did she know, the consequences of her choices would soon lead to something far more deadly than a virus, a series of events that would leave lives shattered and lead to a brutal, irreversible tragedy. Tyrone had always been a strong and healthy man, known for his physical stamina and robust presence. But lately, something wasn't right. At first, it was subtle: an occasional headache, a little more tired than usual, and an unfamiliar weight loss that couldn't be explained by his regular workout routine. He brushed it off, assuming it was stress from the increasing demands of his work and the pressures that came with being married to a woman as powerful and influential as Mikey. But when the symptoms worsened, he couldn't ignore them any longer. One evening, after struggling to get through a dinner meeting with clients, he found himself unable to shake a severe fatigue that had been building for days. His body felt heavy, his joints sore, and his mind clouded. It wasn't just exhaustion, it felt like something was deeply wrong. His thoughts turned to his health, and he made the decision to go to the doctor the very next day. The test results came back quickly, but the diagnosis hit him like a freight train: Tyrone had contracted HIV. He sat in the sterile white room of the clinic, his hands trembling as the doctor explained the severity of the virus and the long-term implications it would have on his health. The words were a blur, but one thing stuck with him: he had the virus, and it wasn't something he could undo. The shock washed over him in waves, and a suffocating mix of confusion, anger, and despair consumed him. How could this happen? He hadn't been with anyone else, hadn't strayed from Mikey, his beautiful, successful wife. The doctor informed him that HIV could have been contracted from unprotected sex, but Tyrone couldn't understand how. He'd always trusted Mikey, believed in her loyalty, and their marriage had been the epitome of success. But now, the foundation of everything he had built with her was crumbling beneath his feet. Devastated and overwhelmed, Tyrone returned home, his mind racing. He tried to push through the anger and hurt, but the weight of it all was unbearable. When he walked through the front door of their elegant house, Mikey was in the living room, sipping her evening wine, looking as poised and composed as ever. The sight of her felt like a slap in the face. She was the woman he had trusted with everything, and yet she had betrayed him in the most unimaginable way. He couldn't hold it in any longer. His voice, trembling with a mixture of hurt and rage, cut through the air as he demanded, "How did I get this, Mikey? How? I've been faithful to you. How could you do this to me?" Mikey's heart dropped at the sight of Tyrone, standing there in the middle of the living room, his face pale, his eyes filled with confusion and pain. She had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared her for the fury and heartbreak that poured from her husband. The weight of her lies, of the secret she had buried so deeply, was suffocating. She could see it in his eyes, the betrayal was written all over his face. He knew. She stood frozen, her mind racing for the right words, but there were no words that could undo the damage, no explanations that could heal the hurt. She had always been able to control situations, always been able to handle her life with poise and grace, but now she was facing the consequences of the reckless affair with Jasmine and the virus she had unknowingly brought home to her husband. Tyrone's voice cracked as he demanded an answer. "How long, Mikey? How long have you been hiding this from me? How could you put me at risk like this? What the hell is going on?" Mikey opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She could see the raw emotion in Tyrone's eyes, and for a brief moment, she saw the man she had once loved so deeply, the man who had given her everything, now shattered and broken by her actions. She couldn't bear to look him in the eyes. She had to tell him the truth, but the thought of it felt like a death sentence to her marriage, her life. Tyrone's anger intensified when he saw her hesitation, and the room seemed to close in around them. His fists clenched as the rage finally exploded. "Don't tell me you've been cheating on me, Mikey. Don't you dare say that." Mikey closed her eyes, tears welling up. She couldn't keep the truth from him any longer. I was with someone else, Tyrone," she whispered, barely able to speak the words. "I made a mistake. I didn't mean for this to happen. I didn't know." Tyrone stared at her, his expression a mix of disbelief and pain. His mind couldn't process the depth of her betrayal, couldn't comprehend how everything he thought he knew about their relationship had been a lie. His knees buckled, and he collapsed onto the couch, his head in his hands. The woman he had married, the woman who was supposed to be his partner, his ally, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. And the worst part was, he was now infected with a virus he couldn't escape. The silence between them was deafening, both of them consumed by the gravity of the situation. In that moment, Mikey knew their marriage was over, but it was the damage to Tyrone's life, to his health, that would haunt them both forever. Tyrone's mind raced as Mikey's confession hung in the air, each word striking him like a heavy blow. The image of his wife, the woman he had built his entire life with, standing there, admitting to not only the affair but also the fact that she had brought a deadly virus into their home, overwhelmed him with a mix of rage and disbelief. Jasmine's name echoed in his mind like a taunt, and the realization that the betrayal had been much deeper than he had imagined made his blood boil. Mikey's voice trembled as she continued, explaining how she had gotten caught up in the affair, how Jasmine's presence had ignited something in her that she hadn't been able to control. She told him how the affair had been reckless, how it had led to her contracting HIV, and how, in her selfish desire for secrecy, she had put Tyrone at risk without a second thought. It felt like the walls were closing in on her, her confession finally dragging the weight of her actions into the open. Tyrone couldn't hold it in any longer. The words, her admission, her betrayal, her utter disregard for his health, struck him to his core. His hands clenched into fists, his breathing shallow and erratic as the rage surged within him. The man who had once been the image of composure, the successful businessman, was now consumed by an all-encompassing fury that clouded his judgment. He had been hurt before, but nothing had prepared him for this. "Everything I've done for you," Tyrone seethed, his voice cracking with emotion, "and this is how you repay me? You infect me with this disease, after everything I gave you? All those years, Mikey, and you destroy me like this?" Mikey tried to speak, to explain herself further, but the hurt in Tyrone's voice only seemed to fan the flames of his rage. He could no longer process the lies, the years of deceit, the way his life had been turned upside down by someone he trusted more than anyone in the world. His vision blurred with tears and anger as he reached for the gun he had kept in the drawer of the side table beside the couch. He didn't think about it, didn't weigh the consequences, he just acted, his instincts consumed by the overpowering need to escape the pain. Before Mikey could even react, Tyrone raised the gun, his hands shaking violently as he pointed it toward her. "I can't live with this, Mikey. I can't live with what you've done to me," he muttered under his breath. His voice trembled with grief and anger, each word coming out like a declaration of devastation. Mikey's eyes widened in shock as she took a step back, her breath catching in her throat. She had never seen Tyrone like this, never imagined him capable of this kind of violence. But the moment seemed to stretch on forever, the weight of their crumbling world hanging in the air between them. She tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. The distance between them had never felt wider. In an instant, the sound of a gunshot rang through the house. Mikey collapsed to the floor, a single shot echoing through the room. Tyrone stood there, frozen, the gun still gripped in his trembling hand. The anger that had driven him to pull the trigger quickly gave way to a crushing realization. His breath caught in his throat as he looked down at Mikey, her body unmoving on the floor. Panic set in. He had acted without thinking, without understanding the magnitude of his actions. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in his ears as his mind spun out of control. Mikey, the woman he had loved, the woman who had betrayed him, was now lying dead at his feet. Tyrone dropped the gun, his hands now slick with sweat. He stumbled back, his legs giving out beneath him. He collapsed against the wall, sinking to the floor, his body racked with sobs. The world around him seemed to blur, spinning out of focus as the consequences of his violent outburst became clear. He had killed her. His wife. His partner. But as the reality of what he had done sank in, so did the terrifying realization that there was no turning back. After the devastating confrontation and Mikey's death, the chain of events moved swiftly. Tyrone's actions had set into motion a tragic sequence that would ripple through their lives, and the lives of those around them, leaving a wake of chaos, heartbreak, and unrelenting media scrutiny. As Tyrone sat motionless in the corner of the room, his body shaking, the reality of what had just transpired began to consume him. He had killed his wife in a fit of blind rage, but there was no escape from the consequences. The house was eerily quiet, save for his ragged breathing and the distant sound of sirens approaching. He had barely noticed the wail of police vehicles as they neared his home, the flashing lights cutting through the darkness outside. It was the housekeeper, who had been arriving for her evening shift, who first discovered the aftermath. She had been startled by the strange silence inside the house, finding it odd that Mikey's car was parked in the driveway but there were no sounds coming from within. As she stepped inside, she was immediately confronted by the sight of Tyrone, slumped against the wall, his tear-streaked face contorted in a mix of sorrow and fear. The gun lay on the floor beside him, still warm from the violence it had just inflicted. Her instinct was to rush toward Mikey. When she entered the living room and saw Mikey lying motionless on the floor, her heart skipped a beat. There was no sign of life, Mikey was gone. The housekeeper froze, realizing instantly that something had gone horribly wrong. She quickly stepped back and, her hands shaking, dialed 911. Tyrone, still dazed and numb, barely noticed her hurried actions. His mind was racing, but all he could think about was how everything had come crashing down in an instant. He had taken Mikey's life, and now there was no escaping the aftermath. His entire world was collapsing around him. When the 911 operator answered, the housekeeper's voice trembled as she spoke, trying to remain calm as she explained what had happened. "There's been a shooting, there's a man here. He's hurt, I think, but the woman, she's dead." She barely managed to finish the sentence before the operator instructed her to stay on the line and assured her that help was on the way. Within minutes, the police arrived, their sirens blaring through the night air. The officers burst through the door, their guns drawn and ready, though there was no immediate threat. Tyrone remained in the same spot, his body limp and his head hung low. His hands were stained with Mikey's blood, and he seemed to barely register the presence of the officers as they approached. "Tyrone Simmons," one of the officers said sternly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Mikey Simmons." Tyrone barely flinched at the words. He had already known, in the pit of his stomach, that his fate had been sealed the moment he pulled the trigger. The shock of what had happened still hadn't fully sunk in, but he knew there was no going back. He was cuffed and led out of the house, his mind numb as he was placed in the back of a squad car. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, watching as the officers took Tyrone away, her face a mask of disbelief. The investigation began almost immediately, and the details of Mikey's affair and HIV status quickly came to light, making the entire case even more explosive. Tyrone's world, already shattered by the loss of his wife, was now under a harsh spotlight. As the days passed, the media seized on the story, sensationalizing every aspect of it. The public was captivated by the story of the successful businesswoman who had betrayed her husband with a secret affair, only to bring a deadly virus into their home. The fact that Mikey had contracted HIV through unprotected sex with Jasmine Clark, a young woman she had been involved with, added another layer of controversy. The media focused on the reckless nature of Mikey's behavior, the dangerous risk she had taken, and the way it had ultimately destroyed both her marriage and her life. Tyrone was eventually charged with second-degree murder, and his trial became a spectacle for the public. It was a case that captivated people's attention, torn between pity for a man who had been deceived by his wife and anger at the brutality of his actions. The courtroom was filled with emotion, and the verdict was finally delivered. Tyrone was sentenced to 25 years in prison, without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, Mikey's death remained a tragic reminder of the destructive consequences of betrayal. The ripple effects of her affair with Jasmine and the virus she passed on to Tyrone would haunt them both forever, leading to the senseless violence that shattered everything they had once known. The tragic end of Mikey Simmons and the devastating consequences of her infidelity highlight the fragile nature of trust and the far-reaching impact of betrayal. Tyrone's life was forever changed by his actions, and the ripple effects of this crime continue to stir up questions about relationships, deceit, and accountability. Do you think Tyrone's actions were a result of pure rage and betrayal, or was Mikey's secret life ultimately to blame for the deadly consequences? If this story shocked you, be sure to subscribe to Crime Chronicles for more chilling tales that expose the darkest secrets of human behavior.